right, so welcome everyone. I'm Lauren Cook. I am the Dean of Gap Year and College Advising at JCHS. If we haven't met before, officially welcome to the process, or unofficially welcome to the process, as we're going to have kind of a slow slide into things this fall. And if we have met before and I've worked with other kids of yours, I'm excited to do it again. So a few housekeeping notes. It's excellent if folks can stay on mute. I see that you are all on mute so far, which is great. I'm going to do a little content up top here. And so if we can minimize noise, that will be great. I hope car alarms won't go off outside my apartment. And then I will use the balance of the time for questions. And so putting those in the chat, using the little Zoom hand raise, whatever works for you, I will answer them. And we're going to have a hard stop at 7:30, whether we're done with questions or not, but know that you can certainly email me and we're going to keep this conversation going. So that's the plan for this evening. And as I said in my email early today, my plan is to touch on a couple of things. The process at JCHS for the next few months. So we all feel like we have some direction about what's going to happen before the big formal launch on November 30th. To answer some questions that are coming up right now about testing and the testing landscape. I know that that's often the thing that for parents anyway feels really pressing at this time of the year. Point you towards some resources, especially if this is your first child that is going through the college admission process, and make sure you're aware of events that should be on your calendar just for this fall as relates to college. And then I'm going to stop talking. I will say that we don't formally start this process, as I've said a couple of times here, until December really of junior year. And that is the standard across independent schools in the Bay Area. But I have found that having this quick kind of touch base in the fall can be useful for everyone, just so we feel like we know where we're at in the process and what's coming. So that's the purpose of this evening. And for students that may be on the call, we did have a class meeting earlier today. So they've gotten a little bit of information, but more about the colleges that are going to be coming to JCHS, which I'll mention in a moment, and less about some of the meat of testing and all the rest. So slightly different information, but they did get a warm up on some of this earlier today. And I did assure them that if there are games or practices or other things they're at this evening, if there's a family representative here, that's fine, or they can watch the video afterwards. So, okay, enough with the preamble. Let's get started talking about the process. So as I noted, what we do is exactly the same as almost all the Bay Area independent schools. I'm on listservs and go to meetings. In fact, we all have a happy hour on Thursday with college counselors from the other schools in the Bay Area. So we are right in line with what everyone else does, which is kind of a gentle start in the fall. We want juniors to adjust to junior year first. There's often a step up in curriculum and, leadership roles and all the rest, and to do some college exploring somewhat independently, either through SCORE and other kind of search engines and places on the web where you can start to see what's out there in the world, through the colleges that come to visit JCHS, which will start next Tuesday and stretch into the first week of November. And your family may have already been on some college campuses. You may be thinking, we've got a vacation or a bar mitzvah or something coming up where you're traveling. You might be out near some schools of interest and decide to noodle around there. This is all helpful, right, as we start to gain some idea about what college looks like. And if, students have preferences about location, about size, just to kind of do some shopping and try on, possible kind of futures for themselves. And in terms of the visits to JCHS, hopefully everyone saw my email today. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's good just to look through and see what it means to attend a college visit, which are open just to juniors and seniors. It can mean missing class, so it does mean some organization around letting faculty know if you're going to be missing class. And the calendar, all of the appointments that are happening are in SCORE. And so it is on the students to RSVP for visits. But, families, you might want to sit down together and just talk a little bit about types of schools and what a student might want to think about going to. Even if you have no idea where you want to go or don't know any of these school names, pick 4 or 5 of them and just go see. You don't have to have a serious interest in a school to sit through the presentation and see what it's all about. And in fact, it will help figure out some preferences and priorities. On November 30th, and this is an important date to have on your calendar, we will do our official kickoff for the college process. And I usually have a guest speaker or two, as well as myself, talking about what's going to be coming in the winter and spring. I'm thinking that we're probably going to do that on Zoom. I found that, well, I know we don't maybe all love going back to Zoom life. It is easier for folks with a long commute and being able to record the evening and all the rest. And it is easier for some of our guest speakers as well. So more information on that to come, but it will be Wednesday, November 30th. And that's a really important either meeting to attend or to make sure you watch the video soon after. And then in December, we will get into questionnaires that I'm going to ask both students and parents to fill out. I'll schedule one-on-one meetings with every student for about an hour. We'll just get to know each other, talk a little bit about what they know, what they don't know, aspirations, and just to lay the groundwork to get things started. And then I'll start suggesting schools and we'll really get rolling. So November 30th is the moment where it gets really real. And I will ask that up until then, if we can keep, especially sort of family appointments and all of that, either off the table or to a minimum. I am happy to answer emails. I really want students to swing by my office and introduce themselves if we haven't met already. But I am, going 90 miles an hour with the seniors right now, trying to get their applications in order and out the door. So I need to protect my time, and I know you will appreciate me doing that next year when all of you are in the same kind of senior position. I'm going to pivot now and talk a little bit about testing because I already have been getting emails about that. And I will start by saying to parents, if you haven't had a child go through this process yet, the role of testing in the college admission process has totally changed since you were applying to college, since I was applying to college, in terms of it being sort of required, standard, a thing that everybody does. And I will say it's changed perhaps even if you've had other kids go through this process since then. The testing landscape right now, and by that I mean the ACT and the SAT, and these are the two big standardized tests. Every college accepts both. And so students usually find out which one sort of works better for them and go with one of the two tests. This was already evolving prior to the pandemic, but COVID really accelerated the role that testing is playing in college admission in terms of de-emphasizing it. Before March of 2020, there were about 800 colleges that weren't requiring testing, that were test optional. And then the pandemic forced just about everybody to go test optional. A very small handful either didn't go test optional or have reverted back. And by small handful, I can literally tell you it's the service academies. So I don't know of anyone right now that's thinking about West Point or the Air Force Academy, but those stayed requiring the tests. The public institutions in Florida and Georgia never got rid of testing. And that is because their state legislatures are the folks that determine college admission requirements for the public institutions, and they never rolled back the testing requirements. So some folks, Georgia Tech, University of Florida, it's been an issue. And then Georgetown, which is not one of my favorite schools in terms of how they sort of run their own process, but Georgetown last year went back to requiring testing. So as you can see, it's like a very small number of schools, but there are some of them where testing is still a piece. But the vast majority, and I mean like 3,500 other colleges, are in either a test optional space right now or actually test free or test blind. You're going to see different kinds of terminology. Maybe you've seen in the news, the University of California system, the California state system, they are no longer accepting tests. They're not looking at the SAT or the ACT. And there are some private institutions, Caltech, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Pitzer, Dickinson, Reed, they are either in a permanent or test phase of also being test blind or test free. So why are schools doing this? Well, obviously during the pandemic, it was difficult to test. It was actually like dangerous to test before we had vaccines and all of that, to go in a room and take a test together for 4 hours. But there's also been a lot of, I think, warranted criticism of and scrutiny around standardized tests as being, a predictive tool for college admission. It's highly correlated to family income. And so there's a lot of studies coming out that are making colleges think twice about requiring these things. So what does this mean for you? Folks right now are curious about when to test, and I would say that's kind of the wrong question. I think we need to find out, first of all, if you need to test based on your aspirations, your list, your learning profile, et cetera, and then which test we're going to take and when we're going to do it. It has never really been necessary for students to do prep or actual testing in the fall of junior year. It's just not curricularly appropriate for a lot of students, but it's also timing wise, just not a great idea. But as I said, depending on your learning profile, now that things are very optional, you might not need to spend the time and energy on doing something that might not be in your wheelhouse when there are other parts of your application that can shine more. We need to know if you even need to test based on your list. And I will say that about a third of this year's senior class, the class of 2023, is off the testing bus altogether. And it may be because their list is mostly UCs and CSUs. It may be because the kinds of places they're looking were test optional before the pandemic, and we don't know that a score that they get will be value added. So these are questions that we're going to want to answer before we jump into taking the test and all of that. I will also say that it's still kind of a bad look for a junior this fall or even early winter to be taking a testing spot from a senior, because it was still hard this past spring to get an actual sitting for a test for the class of 2023. Cancellations were still happening. There's such high demand that seats were booking up really quickly. And colleges will notice that sort of thing. There are dates and all of that on when you take tests. So all of that is to say, this is not pressing in this moment to take a test like in November. I will advise you to hold off on prep and all of that and stick with the JCHS kind of schedule of practice testing. This is the first question, ACT or SAT, and which one might be better for you. We will offer both of those practice tests, and I'll show some dates in a minute, this fall. And then in the winter, when we have our first meeting, we will talk about which test, what are the aspirations, what colleges might be on the list, and answer the questions of should you test, and if so, which one. And then prep is typically a winter, a spring activity, and then there's testing in the late spring, summer, and next fall. I did get a question that was probably smart from a parent about should you just book a seat for next spring? Because I think it's open, if not for both the SAT and the ACT, at least for one of them. And maybe because it has been hard to kind of get seats that aren't an hour, 2 hours, another state away, the downside is that you might not need it, right? And so you might lose a little money. I think they refund half or 2/3 of your registration cost if you cancel it. But the upside is you would have a seat, and you would decide later on if you need to use it. So I'll leave that to individual families to decide if you want to reserve an ACT or SAT spot next May or June or whatnot, and then cancel it if need be. But I think that is the most test stuff we need to be doing in this moment. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here for a second. We're getting really close to me stopping with the monologue, and then I can get your questions. So, all right, let me just do the slideshow. All right, so I now just want to mention quickly about the events that I mentioned. So as I said, college visits are happening starting next Tuesday. So that's something that should be on the junior radar screen. We will have our PSAT, which everyone did last sophomore year at JCHS. We'll do it again next month, in October, on October 12th. It's a Wednesday. I would encourage just about everybody to do the PSAT. There might be an exception or two here and there, but just to see what the practice test score is, you do not need to prep for this test. This is literally a practice. And then we will hold a free practice ACT at JCHS on November 6th, which is a Sunday. Compass Education Group, it's a great test prep organization in the Bay, comes and does live proctoring to simulate a real ACT, both for folks with accommodations and those with standard timing. They turn results around to students pretty quickly. And then we have 2 practice test scores and can compare them. And there are correlation charts we can look at to see, what one score on a PSAT is equivalent to on the ACT, and see if one test feels better to your student, if one test you score higher sort of naturally on it without a bunch of prep. And that is a good indicator for us about which one might be the right one for you. And then, of course, we'll have a meeting to talk about, do we even need to test? So I would highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to still engage in the PSAT and the practice ACT. And then we will have some conversations about what to do with those results. If you cannot make the November 6th date, it is a Sunday. I know that folks may be out of town or whatnot. Let me know. And typically Compius can make some other arrangements for you to be able to still do a practice test with them at another time. Usually they charge for this kind of thing, but they do this for free as like a partner school with JCHS. So we just make sure that we would schedule that through our contacts so that they don't charge you for it. And then, as I mentioned before, there is, oh, now I'm not getting my last bullet point. There we go, college kickoff on November 30th. So these really 3 specific dates are the most important things this fall for the college process. And then we will talk about the winter and the spring at the kickoff. And I will just close my comments by noting a few resources if you are super eager to get going on all of this. There is a 30-page handbook I've written for all of you that is sitting on the College Advising website. And you can download that and read it at your leisure. You can look at it in order. You can look at pieces that are relevant right now, but there are things like a checklist for junior year about sort of what's happening during each season, information on how to visit college campuses, about going into college interviews, how to noodle around and score. So that is all there for you right now. And for anyone who likes to go sort of all the way in learning about stuff, these are 2 college search, college process books that I recommend. They're both geared a bit more towards parents than students in terms of tone and content. But the College Conversation, Eric Furta is the Dean of Admission at Penn, and Jock Steinberg is a friend and was the education reporter at the New York Times for a really long time, ran a blog for them and everything. It's all about the college search, the process, questions to ask, how to visit schools, things to be thinking about in sort of a academic and analytical way. And then the price you pay for college is obviously more about the financial piece of things and not necessarily financial advising, although the author Ron Lieber is the personal finance columnist for the New York Times, but really asking some deep questions that you should be asking yourself about what are you getting from the schools that you're looking at? What's the difference in some of these price points and what they offer to you, and how to make some smart financial value decisions for your family with this process that has become pretty expensive. So those are some recommendations about things to be thinking about in the coming months. And I am now going to stop sharing my screen and stop monologuing and check out what's in the chat here to begin with, but we will officially enter some question time. So first question in the chat was about Canadian schools and testing, and that is such a good question. So if you're a student or students, if you're on the call, if you are thinking about going outside of the US, things get a little bit different. Both Canadian schools, UK schools, some other European schools, some Israeli schools are in a different place with testing. Historically, testing was very important to them because in those individual countries, there might be a more uniform either curriculum in their schools or a set of tests that as a American student you haven't had access to. So they use the SAT and ACT or AP scores as well in a way where that's how they make meaning of whether you're going to be a match with their curriculum. And so most of those places are still test optional, but some are, it looks like, sort of wavering on maybe requiring tests again. And many of these international schools have application deadlines that are a little after American schools, so they don't feel the rush to let us know what their policies are right at the beginning of the process. So for example, right now, most of the Israeli colleges that we might have students applying to haven't yet updated their website about what current seniors have to do because their applications aren't due until like June 1st. So TBD on, there's no one way that everything's going, but if you're interested in McGill, for example, we can look and see and contact the rep at McGill about what that might look like. But if you're looking outside the country, you might need to do some testing. I guess that's the headline. There's also a question about, MIT went back to, yes, MIT has said they very much value test scores. And I find it really interesting because we've got MIT now requiring test scores again and Caltech being entirely test free. So as you think about sort of the two elite technological institutions, they're each taking different tracks, and we'll see, I'm sure that they will both fill us in on the reports of how those students are doing on campuses, if there's big differences in GPA and performance and all the rest. Okay, next question. To understand where free speech is still alive, where a student could safely voice being pro-Israel, I found this ranking helpful. Yes, and I will be sending out, I will start by saying I don't love college rankings generally, but by that I usually mean US News and World Report, and some of these other large publications that really exist to sell subscriptions and magazines and not actually to do a good service to education and students. But you can look at Hillel.org, you could look at Chabad, you can look at the Orthodox Union. There are a lot of places that are making lists and giving data that can be useful because it is more targeted and student-centered and trying to think about what a particular group of students might be interested in or need. So I will push some of those resources out as they come across my plate, but as you find them, please share them as well, because I do think they can be helpful. I have a message about, if my child requires testing accommodations, what's the JCHS process and requirements? Excellent question. So you will hopefully have the same accommodations that you have at JCHS if you have gone through actual diagnostic testing and have sort of a formalized learning plan. When you are registering for a test, there is one box you will check that says, yes, my child has accommodations. So you're registering for the ACT. ACT will then email Dr. Neufeld saying, so-and-so has signed up for the ACT and is requesting accommodations. And Dr. Neufeld, as our learning support point person at the school, then will supply ACT with whatever documentation is needed. So sometimes that's letters, sometimes that's test reports, doctor report, whatnot. If you don't have something formal on file or it hasn't been updated in a while, you might want to think about doing that in the next few months. And if you're not quite sure what you might need, reaching out to Dr. Neufeld will be helpful. So David Neufeld, if you haven't met him or worked with him yet, is really kind of taking over Yael Krieger's role and work at JCHS that she had been doing with learning support. So it's really, if they've got accommodations already, as easy as checking it off on the registration, and then we will pick up some of the verification of that. Much of the time accommodations are approved, but sometimes they are not. So sometimes it takes a time or two of applying for the accommodations with whatever test provider it is to figure out exactly what it is they need to say yes to, whether it's 50% time or a laptop being used or whatnot. But again, Dr. Neufeld can be helpful in partnering with you with that. Let's see. Another question. Which website would tell me which international schools qualify for accepting 529 college saving plan payments? That is a great question. It's also very specific, and I'm not sure I know that off the top of my head, but that's a to-do list I'm going to write down. And there are also some financial planners and financial sort of assistance folks that you can partner with to do some of the paperwork on this process, depending on how complicated your family situation is and all the rest. I will be sending some of those names out as we get further into the year. So know that you don't necessarily have to navigate the complications or the various situations of all of this alone. And JFCS, Jewish Family and Children's Services, also offers financial aid workshops 2 times a year in the fall and in January. And I will send out flyers and information when they've got those set and come in, but those are free and also very helpful, especially if you haven't been through this process before. So I will get back to the person asking about 529s. And then what else? How long is a while for not updating a 504 plan? That is a great question. Is 8th grade recent enough? I would say it would be good to have a 504 plan that has been updated or some kind of diagnostic testing and all of that from high school. I don't know that that's a hard and fast rule. Some people might take 8th grade, but when we see complications or denial of accommodations, it's often sometimes because they think the information's outdated. So having something from, sophomore, junior year can be particularly helpful. Okay. Can I talk a bit about early decision, early action, restrictive early action, pros and cons? Then as a Miss Cook alumni, I'm the best. Thank you so much. I love having repeat customers. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, because I think one thing that can be a real source of anxiety in this process is trying to think about all of it at once. And what you really need to do is do some bite-sized chunks of this, or else you're going to make yourself crazy. But there are different ways of applying to college. And it's a conversation that I'm having literally right now. Had an application workshop after school with some seniors today, trying to decide, are we looking at early action, early decision? So basically, the old way of applying to college, where there was one deadline and you could get your answer and decide on if you wanted to attend, that's called regular decision. Regular deadlines generally are in January, and you can get your offers back in March and then decide by May 1 where you want to go. In the last 20 years or so, schools have started adding other plans. Ostensibly, if something is your first choice, then you don't have to apply to a bunch of different places. You could apply to that first choice early, find out if you're in, and then be done with your process. It sounds delightful. It's gotten a little complicated, and it can be hard for some families to consider if you need to weigh financial options from a number of different institutions. If there is a clear first choice, early decision, and you can think about it as if you have to make a decision because you only apply to one place, early decision. It's a binding agreement. If you apply there early and you are admitted, you are expected that you're going to attend. And you sign something, student signs something, I sign something, all saying we're all clear. This is the one place they're applying to early. It's their top choice. And another set of early options are not binding, called early action. And that's where they act on your application early. You send it in early. They tell you if you're in or not. And you can sit on that admission offer then until May 1st, which is sort of the universal response date. Restricted early action, it's a whole other thing that a couple of like Ivies in Stanford have created as their own lane. I don't want to get you too confused, but know that that's something that's out there as well. It's basically, again, making a choice on something early and needing to narrow in on one option. All of these kinds of plans can have strategic benefit to them. Most, especially selective and highly selective colleges, are admitting 40 or 50% of their classes through early plans. This is great to know that strategically you have this option to really show your interest and maybe take advantage of those higher admit rates. But again, as I mentioned earlier, if you really need to weigh financial offers, if finances are going to play a big role in your process, putting all your eggs in that early basket can feel really nerve-wracking and risky and maybe like not a good idea. We will get more into how to navigate some of this and whether an early plan is going to make sense for you. But know that this is out there. When people talk about early, they're talking about this binding or non-binding time to get applications in. And it's something to consider, especially if the aspirations for the student or the parents are for a place that's got one of those like single-digit admit rates. So I'm going to pause there on that because, again, I don't want to overwhelm. Okay, question about statistic data comparing the enrollment of JCHS students. Yes. It is getting subjective. Most of the concentration would be on the application itself. That's very subjective. Yes, how do schools review the applicant? Socioeconomic, schools, more preference. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about holistic admission and what colleges are actually basing decisions on. So a lot of colleges are going to talk to you about how they have a holistic admission process, meaning they are trying to look at the student in 360 degrees. And generally, this is a good thing, because when we talk about test scores and GPA, we're talking about some blunt instruments that have stories behind them. So when there is writing, when there's an activities list and some description of things, when there are letters of recommendation, when there's an interview report, all of these things can round out an application. They can provide some context that might be really important. They can add nuance. They can allow the student with the writing to frame the narrative about themselves a bit, and really help admission officers get to know what's behind the 4 hours you spent on that test, or the limits or the expansive options of your curriculum, what was happening when you earned those grades, et cetera, et cetera. So generally, holistic admission, I think, is a pretty good thing because it allows you to tell your story. And it will mean that if you have a C one year, that doesn't preclude you from going to, a certain place that doesn't typically admit students with Cs. If you're able to talk about the concussion that you had, or, the struggle in online learning during COVID, it's about looking at the context and more things about the students than just sort of a math equation around test scores and grades. Now, that said, yes, of course, it becomes a bit more subjective. Admission offices tend to be doing really great training with their readers, talking about spotting their own biases. When I was an admission officer in my first year, I remember anytime I read an application by someone who kind of sounded like me, like did theater in high school at a public school in the Midwest, it's like, oh my gosh, that's the person I want to admit. Because of course, we like thinking about replicating ourselves, right? And so admission offices are really proactive about getting ahead of that and making sure that you're clear on what the mission of that institution is as a reader, trying to find good matches with the school, and finding ways to sort of try and put some objective metrics on these more subjective things. But it does make it harder to predict. And so to the question about, is there data from the last 2 years, now that you all are in SCORE, know that for every college profile that's in SCORE, if we have had more than 5 students apply in the last 5 years, there's a scattergram that's going to tell you what the stats on that student were, who got in, who were waitlisted, and who were denied. So if you go to a college profile like Brandeis and you click on, I think it's admission as one of their tabs, then you have the option to look at the scattergram. And it's a blunt instrument again. It's GPA and test scores. And some folks don't have test scores, but they'll still appear if there's a GPA there. But it can give you a ballpark about where your own stats might fit into what's happened historically. But we are in a little bit of a Wild West in terms of this new disruption with the test optional of it all, and then the test free at some institutions. So I do my best to predict these things, and I will put predictions on folks' college lists saying, I think if a school is going to be a reach for you or a possible or a likely. And these are questions that you can ask college reps this fall as well. And they come in, how are they making their decisions now? What's changed since the ability to always have a test score has been removed? So I hope that's helpful. Please discuss out-of-state fees and how to avoid them. Such a good question. Well, you can't always avoid them. I'm going to say that. But in terms of the funding of it all, understand that in the state of California, you have in-state tuition at UCs and CSUs. When you are looking at Michigan or Wisconsin or University of Florida, you are an out-of-state student. And so, yes, it's going to cost more. But there is still need-based aid that's available to families if you might qualify for it based on your family's income. And that can be both federal and state-based. And then schools are doing wildly different things with scholarship money, with merit aid. Some places will hand out money to you based on a talent. So whether that's athletic ability, a musical talent or whatnot, and some will sort of call it holistically, you are a great applicant in our pool, and here's a presidential scholarship for $25,000 a year. These are going to come more often from a private institution than a public, but financial aid and merit scholarships are increasingly a way for colleges to try and increase their appeal, right, and to yield more students. So people are using free, unexpected money to try and get students to enroll. Now, are these the schools that have a single digit admit rate, no, they don't need to use money to get folks to enroll, right? But a lot of out-of-state publics, many private institutions, and I will say lots of schools that on a student's college list are listed as possible to admit them or likely to admit them also means it's pretty possible for you to pay for it, or likely you can pay for it, because the student is going to be higher priority in the applicant pool. And so there might be money extended to get them to enroll. So you can avoid out-of-state fees if you're interested in an out-of-state public school, but there might be some mitigation of that. The unfortunate thing, and one reason why I think it's great to read Ron Lieber's book about the price you pay for college, is that this is one of the biggest things we pay for in our lifetimes, the college education, where we don't really know what it's going to cost up front. It's really not until you get the offer from the school where you might be pleasantly surprised. You might also be horrified. You thought it was going to be more. So this is our system right now, for better or for worse. And I'm going to do what I can to help you feel armed and educated, but know that there is always going to be some element of unpredictability until we see an admission offer and then the financial letter that comes with it. So that's the best I can say at this point. Gear up. So it can be a little bit of a roller coaster. All right, we have a pause in the chat. Does anyone have questions they want to ask out loud? You are so welcome. Or if you want to add anything else in the chat. Now we're covering a lot of ground and this may feel like a lot for everyone, but we have 2 years to work all the way through this. By when do we have to know our choices? Excellent question. So this winter, some students are already following colleges and SCORE. Great. This winter, once I have a one-on-one meeting with each student, I'm going to suggest a set of colleges based on our conversations and questionnaires and what I know about them, maybe 15 or so schools. And then the winter, the spring, the summer, that is all about exploring places. You can throw out my whole list. You can decide you like most of my list. You can take some, leave some, but it will be an evolving, iterative thing over several months. And then in senior year, by October 1st, I want seniors to have a final college list. That is usually the deadline that I set. I think it's October 3rd this year because that's a Monday. So that's a lot of what I was doing with seniors today. We're starting to move things into the applying column in SCORE and starting to make sure things look balanced on all the rest. But you have a little more than a year to have a pretty good idea about where you're at least applying. And can you change your mind a little bit after that? Sure, we can always tweak it a little bit, but we need time to be working on those applications next fall, make sure that any individual questions they might have. Tulane loves to ask, for example, why do you want to go to Tulane? You can write up to 700 words about it. And so then there's a feeling of, do I have to write 700 words about why Tulane? So we want to have time to be kind of working through each of the schools that you're looking at and really spend time expressing your interest and your knowledge about them. There's a question about transferring to a UC from a community college. Excellent question. So know that that is an option. I'm focusing a lot right here on the 4-year college process because that is the most complicated, that we need a long runway for post JCHS option. But of course, we've got folks that are going into the IDF, that are going to work, that are going to community college. And we are really lucky to have an amazing community college system in California that has something called the TAG program, Transfer Admission Guarantee, with 5 of the 9 UCs. Meaning that if you follow a path, you cut off, certain general education requirements early on, you get, whatever it is, like a B and above in all of those classes, you are guaranteed admission to like Davis, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz. You pick one school and you are on that path. So 2 years at a community college, transfer to that UC, 2 years there, you graduate with a degree from that UC. There's no asterisks. It doesn't say anywhere, oh, he also went to a community college. And it's a cheaper path. It is a financially savvy path. The community college path, the downside is anybody can go to a community college, right? There's no application process. The whole world can take classes there. And so you are going to be in a peer culture that is really varied. You're going to have adults, you're going to have vets, you're going to have folks that maybe totally sort of bombed high school and are trying to kind of redo things and build a new academic record. And so You need to be a particularly focused and driven student to make the most of that opportunity, to not necessarily have a cohort around you, because you're usually a day student driving in there to take classes, and to seek out the tag office and figure out what you need to do. Lots of students can be successful at it, but it's just something to consider with the community college transfer path. You can also transfer to the other 4 UCs that aren't on the guarantee path, and those are the more selective ones like Berkeley and UCLA, San Diego. But it's not guaranteed. So you have a very good chance, you have a better chance than your average transfer student, but the guarantee is for 5 UCs. So you can Google tag UC program and read a bit more information about it, but it is good to know that there is that option out there. Okay, can you say again how we can see admitted JCHS student scores on SCORE? Yes. So when you go to an individual college profile, if you put up in the search box UCLA, you're going to see big shiny stuff about UCLA, a couple of different tabs about, students and academics. And I think there's one that says admission. When you click on admission, there should be the option to expand scattergram. It might say data or grid or scattergram on there. If you can't find it, pop by my office at some point this week and I'm happy to show you where it is. It's going to be anonymous, right? Like this is not, your data is not going to go in there with your name attached to it, but you will be able to see some general trends about what range students are in GPA wise that were admitted, that were waitlisted, and that were denied. It's like a green, yellow, red button system. And it can help to give you a sense of where you might fall in the big picture. Do I think University of Florida is a good school? Amazing question. I tend to stay away from language of good schools, bad schools. There are schools that are a good fit for you. There are schools that are not a good fit for you. And so I'd have to know more about what you're interested in studying, what kind of environment you want to be in. I think University of Florida is great for some students. So we'll leave that for now, but can have some personal conversations about that. Downside of community college, if you happen to have a bad grade in the university, your great GPA from community college is not being considered for weighted GPA. Not quite totally understanding that question, but I will say anytime you have a bad grade at some point, that's going to weigh things down a little bit. But there is, again, more complexity to some of this, especially when we're talking about the UCs, the CSUs, which years they're looking at for which grades, and that's stuff that we'll get into on down the road. But right now, do your best in all your classes, whether you're taking them at JCHS or at BYU or doing something online through a community college, and we'll work with whatever results you get when it comes time to submit applications. All right, I think I ran through those questions. Anything else? Again, I know this is a lot of information out the gate. You can always email me with any questions and I will turn things around pretty quickly. We will have our November 30th launch time where all of us will gather together again. And then students know that we will be touching base in person quite a bit after that launch date. Parents, I have tended to, since COVID, and I've decided to just keep it once a month for January, February, March, April, May, have coffee with Miss Cook, again on Zoom, 8 a.m. in the morning. We just have an hour open for questions, conversations, any updates I think you need to know at that moment. I record it, I push it out to everyone. And so know that we will also have some set plan times where you have access to me and we can just nosh and talk about what's happening in the college universe. Anything else? How important are AP classes for college admission? Good, big question. Generally, increasing your rigor over your 4 years in high school is important for college admission, that you are challenging yourself in some reasonable and exciting ways for you in subjects that you're interested in. AP classes are one way to designate rigor, but there's no AP Hebrew, for example. But if you get to AP, Hebrew, or you get to Hebrew literature and language, that's, our advanced Hebrew class. And so I make note of that in my recommendations and whatnot. If you, are taking advanced arts courses or, other things that might not have the AP designation, reps are also going to understand within the context of JCHS what's considered rigorous. But yes, having some AP classes is helpful, especially by the time you get to junior and or senior year. They show that you're challenging yourself. The grade in the class is more important than the test score, for sure. It is looking at your work over the entire year and not just, for 3 hours on that test. But test scores can be another data point that can be useful, especially if you get a 4 or a 5. And you can earn college credit at a lot of institutions, though not every single one, if you receive a 4 or a 5, and at some institutions, a 3. So we'll get more into AP scores and if you're going to report them and all that kind of stuff as we get further into the process. But generally, they can be helpful, but it doesn't mean everybody needs to have AP classes or a bunch of AP classes. I will also say colleges understand the constraints in the JCHS schedule. And even though we offer like 15 APs, nobody's taking 15 APs. They totally get that it's a kind of sprinkled throughout the time at JCHS if students have accessed them. So question about what percentage of students know their major before going off to college. Gosh, I don't know a percentage for that. I would say that maybe half of the class each year is feeling pretty sure about what they want to do when they graduate and head off. The other class is still interested in exploring or undecided. What I would love to know is those who think they know what they want to do, what percentage actually stick with that? Because I think we all change and grow and whatnot. So the most important question I think to be asking yourself as you're doing your college search is, am I looking at schools where if I say I'm interested in something, I'm now kind of committed to that? That's where I'm going to be sort of siloed and be on that path. Or, do I want to look at schools where even if I think I know what I want to do, I've got some wiggle room, I've got the ability to explore and perhaps change majors without a bunch of hoops I have to jump through? That's, I think, a more important question here. I feel like sometimes students feel like they have to know what they want to do. You don't, but I think you should have some clarity about, do you want to have some room to discover and explore? Are you feeling really ready to go to that like engineering school or that music conservatory? That's where your choices can expand and contract. How strongly are schools weighing geographic diversity, advantage to applying to distance schools? Well, the good and the bad news here is that yes, schools are looking at geographic diversity, and California is generally not going to be geographic diversity. We are one of the largest states in the country, the largest populations in the country, probably the most college-going students demographically anywhere in the country. If anything, it's been contracting the number of student 18-year-olds in New England and the Midwest and all of that. California, Florida, Texas, those are the booming states. Now, the good news is that means a lot of reps are coming out to California and recruiting our students because that is the future of their student body. But unfortunately, being from California is probably not going to make you too unusual anywhere. There are lots of other things that are going to make you unusual, but geography is probably not one of them. If you want to move to South Dakota now, that's a way to get into college. Not a lot of people in South Dakota. Okay, can you report only some AP scores, or is it all or nothing? Great question. You are in the driver's seat with AP scores. So it's all a self-reported thing that you put on your application, and colleges do not presume that because you took the class, you took the test. High schools wildly vary on whether those two things are tied together, independent of each other, have nothing to do with each other. They also get the economics of it all. It costs money to take those tests. Some people want prep for them and all of that. Some people are not engaging in that. So that means I would usually recommend you take the test, and then we decide when we get the results of it, who's getting that score, if any. And we might send it to some places where it's going to be a strong score for them, and we might hold it back from others where it's maybe not going to be value added for you. So. All right, it's amazing. Yes, thank you. You're welcome. Briefly explain gap year, pros and cons, for sure. That's also in my job title. So gap year options, terrific options. I love that this is something that's so part of the culture and normalized at JCHS. Every year, anywhere from a quarter to a third of our senior class goes on a gap year. I think we've got 10 folks that are doing a gap year from the class of 2022 right now. And it is essentially a really excellent opportunity to gain some independence, some maturity, to get off of the kind of hamster wheel of K through 12 education and sitting in behind a desk and bells ringing and being told what to study, and just check in with yourself. And you might graduate JCHS thinking, I really like math. But maybe that's because you were given a certain set of academic choices to choose from, and the one you like best of those choices was math. There might be a bunch of other options out there, in college you haven't explored yet. So taking a little time to do something else, to go somewhere else, to just experience the world a little bit can help you land at college more mature and independent, but also a little bit more focused and knowing yourself and able to take advantage of everything that college has to offer, and make the most of really your parents' money in terms of how much it costs to go to college. So I'm a big fan of gap years, and students do all sorts of things with them. Most of our students will end up doing some kind of program in Israel. The programs could be 3 months, 9 months, it could be 2 different programs. They could be based in Tel Aviv. They could have a travel component going to different countries with a home base in Jerusalem. But we also have students go to other countries and do, say, a language immersion program somewhere in Spain. We've had students do, sort of outward bound kinds of things, search and rescue, like in Finland. Like there are other, options as well. But the most well-tread path is certainly Israeli programs. And those are sometimes religious, sometimes not. There's a huge variety of things that you can engage in Israel. There are a lot of brochures in racks by my office. Students are welcome to just sort of peruse things there. We have a bunch of alums that are happy to talk about the benefits of doing that year. And I will have a gap panel on Zoom at some point later this fall. I haven't selected a date yet, but I'm hoping to have 1 or 2 folks that are currently on their gap years, but certainly alums that are in college and their gap years behind them, and they can reflect on it a little bit. I think that's always super helpful for current students to hear about. Sometimes folks are worried about the momentum and losing momentum by taking a year off of writing papers and taking tests and all of that. And sometimes folks thinking about medical school, knowing they already have a long haul of more years of school to go, want to just get on with it and get to it. And that's fine too. But we can discuss these pros and cons individually as we get into the search a little bit. And know that I still want students to be on the path of going through the motions to apply for college until we know for sure that they're going to get off that path or take that pause. And most of those folks that are doing a gap year this year, they have a place being saved for them at a college. You can't defer for a year, whether that's private schools or most of the UCs, not all of them, but most have gotten a lot better about allowing for gap years. So we're still going to do all the things this year as if you're going to college in the fall of 2024. And then when we know that you might not be, we'll go through the appropriate channels to get approval to do something else. All right, 6 minutes left. A couple of more questions. How does it work applying to college? Yeah. So I will say, as I said, you could have a spot saved for you at a college when you go off on your gap year and you're all done. But let's say you weren't happy with your college options. We have one graduate who's in that place and is going to be coming back to me in the fall via Zoom. Sometimes folks go into the IDF and come back to me once they're out, and now they're going to be a first year in college. I've got 2 of those on my plate right now. Sometimes folks go off to college, and despite all this reflection and work and conversation, it's not what they thought it was going to be. And, they want to transfer. I'm available for all of those scenarios. It's one reason why I'm so busy, but it's also really useful because I know you. And when you've graduated and then you come back, I get your whole story. We don't have to sort of review all the things. We can just pick up from there and say, okay, so what is not working, or, what do we need from where you're at right now? And I keep reviewing writing and, sending transcripts out and here for advice. So know that if it doesn't go right the first time around, or we take a left and do something different and then decide on college in a few years, myself or whoever is in my position, in the great future, would be available to help you out. If you do a gap year, does it mean you have to go for 4 years of college, or does it depend on the college? It depends on the college. We did have one student from the class of 2021 that did a Bar Elan program called Israel XP, and earned a whole year's worth of college credit on the gap year. And a lot of it was Hebrew courses, but there were some other classes as well. Is now a transfer student going into Cornell this fall. So there's a variety of types of gap year programs. So you don't necessarily have to do that and then do 4 full years of college. I'm going to call this our last question. For those interested in traditional academic routes, do you have a list of institutions we should consider? If you're meaning colleges and whatnot, I will have lots of suggestions for you, specialized to your particularly interests and parameters and all the rest. But I would say, there are a subset of schools that are popular with JCHS families. No surprise, because many of them will have strong, thriving, large Jewish communities. And so you do not have to select those schools, but they do pop up on a lot of lists for a reason, because our students find the transition from JCHS to be gentle. Some of them, like a Tulane or a Brandeis or whatnot, are going to actually not have classes on the Jewish holidays, which is unfortunately unusual at colleges. So these are conversations we will have as we're going through the process about how important the Jewish community, the Jewish life. Are you observant? Do you keep kosher? So thinking about what's available on some campuses, and that starts to, I think, helpfully narrow in the options a little bit, because right now you got 3,500, 4,000 colleges you can choose from. So let's find some reasons to make that list a little bit smaller. So there's certainly lots of lists for those. And again, I would point you, one of the most helpful ones, just to get a sense of the landscape, is going to Hillel.org and looking at their data on student life, because they have both percentage of Jews on campus and then some basic information about kosher options, if there's a Hillel or a Chabad, and kind of, if it's a more robust Jewish community, there are going to be actual reviews and things up there from students. So that will start to give you the temperature of a place. And when I see, some schools that pop up on lists that might feel really not like great places for Jewish students, I will also point that out as well. Sometimes this is anecdotal, sometimes not, but I want to make sure that folks are sort of getting a lot of perspectives on the places they might be considering, and always trying to visit before making a final decision. Whew, I just did a lot of talking. Y'all did a lot of listening. I hope this was helpful. It is 7:28. I'm going to let you get on with your evenings, but know that we'll send this recording out. I'm so excited to get to know all of you and to be working with all of you. And I know it's awkward to sort of say, let's not set a meeting for tomorrow, but if we can just have a gentle roll into this over the next few weeks, I'm really excited to officially kick things off on November 30th. In the meantime, I hope I'll see your questions in my inbox if things come up, and have a strong start to the school year. Bye.